Okay. I want to say good morning or afternoon or evening, everybody. My name is Miriam Bender. I'm associate professor here in the School of Nursing at the University of California, Irvine, and I am the director of the school's Center for Nursing Philosophy. I welcome you all to this virtual speaker event series in which the center tries to bring the new to nursing in terms of ideas that can help spark novel thinking about our own ideas, practices, and scholarship. We aim for diversity and perspectives and have heard from scholars across multiple disciplines on a wide swath of topics, from nursing and Shakespeare to the decolonization of nursing. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our now third annual colloquium, which is co-sponsored by the Center for Knowledge, Technology, and Society, which is directed, by Duncan Pritchard, who is distinguished professor here at the UCI Department of Philosophy, and co-sponsored by our Center for Nursing Philosophy. I'm also very honored to now be able to hand things over to Tyrus Miller, who will introduce our speaker. Tyrus Miller is the Dean of the School of Humanities and a professor of art history and English. In his professional avatar, he is a scholar of the innovative art and literatures of the 20th century. And I thank you, Tyrus, for chairing this event. Welcome.
Thank you, Miriam. So I'm really delighted to be able to introduce today the presentation by my friend and colleague, Dean Mark Lazenby, entitled What are traditional medicinal substances when separated from traditional ways of life? I'll try not to give any plot spoilers in Dean Lazenby's rich and challenging reflections in this lecture, but I will say that he will train our attention on the forms and ways of life that we live within and too often accept without further reflection, including the contemporary context of healthcare, treatment, and medicine, and also in integrative or alternative medicine, as is suggested by the title and topic of his paper. I'm sure that you'll find the itinerary of his reflections provocative and stimulating, and there'll be much to discuss in the questions that follow. So do put the questions in the question and answer as perhaps Dean Lazenby is speaking and throughout the discussion. Before we start, I'll just say a few selective highlights about Dean Lazenby himself. He is the Dean of the Sue and Bill Gross School of Nursing and a professor of nursing at UCI. He is an international expert on psychosocial spiritual cancer care and a fellow of the American Academy of Nursing. He's authored a trilogy of books on the philosophy of nursing, published by Oxford University Press, presenting a new vision for nursing and its place in the world. These books include Caring Matters Most, The Ethical Significance of Nursing, published in 2017, Towards a Better World, The Social Significance of Nursing, published in 2020, and the forthcoming Practicing the Good Life, The Spiritual Significance of Nursing, which I gather has a close relation to the lecture he'll present today. Dean Lazenby started his academic journey in philosophy, earning his PhD in 2001 in the philosophy of religion from Boston University, and he was a philosophy professor at Gwynedd Mercy College in Philadelphia from 2001 to 2006. He later decided to become an advanced practice cancer nurse, which he did at Yale, earning his Master's of Science in Nursing in 2009. I myself have experienced how he brings this special background and perspective to everything he is doing as a scholar and as a university leader. And on that note, I will hand things over to Dean Lazenby for his lecture.
Thank you, Dean Miller, very much. I'm going to share my screen.
And just while Mark's doing that, I wanted to one more time, as Tyrus already mentioned, please use the chat box as you like to express any thoughts, and use the Q&A box to put forth any questions that you would like Mark to address. And I will be reading them out during the Q&A session. So Mark, without further ado, let's get going.
Thank you very much, Miriam. Last year, in an advisory board meeting to which a group of experts came from around the country to discuss integrative health, discussion turned to what I thought would have been settled by these very experts, the definition of integrative health itself. I admit I was there mostly as an observer. I had no opinion, or I thought I had no opinion, though I formed one soon thereafter, which I'm about to share with you. The definition agreed upon by some of the experts focused on integrating into conventional medicine medicinal substances found mostly in plants that have been used by indigenous peoples, and to care for what we call in healthcare the whole person, integrating into the practice of conventional medicine such complementary practices as acupuncture, massage, tai chi, and yoga. I do not make up these terms conventional and complementary. These are the terms used by the National Institutes of Health's National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. I will figure out how to advance the slides here. By the end of the meeting, what was meant by integrative health for some experts came down to integrating into conventional medicine other cultures' medicinal substances and practices in an attempt to be less medical and more holistic, to use the word the experts used, holistic. Let me say that the term conventional irks me, as does complementary. Hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll know why these terms get under my skin. But first, conventional as a word, of course, means what is generally held to be acceptable. The circularity of conventional is important to my argument. That which is conventional is, of course, established by convention. This implies a social and political positionality. When we speak about medicine, this social and political positionality looms large. The positionality is one of power, the power of ordering and prescribing and instructing and cutting out and replacing with. It is also a positionality of saving from heart attack, from cancer. How many research-intensive cancer centers advertise that their aim is to end cancer? It is the positionality of saving from diseases and disorders and the effects of injuries. I wish to undo this positionality a bit by calling conventional medicine, perhaps some might argue tendentiously calling conventional medicine, the medical industrial complex. I hope it's not too tendentious, because what I mean by it is the whole enterprise in which conventional medicine has its home: bench science, clinical research, the practice of medicine and the practice of surgery, and the whole enterprise that includes vying for federal and foundation funds and vying for patients as if they were markets, which they are in the American medical industrial complex. Floyd Bloom writes about the medical industrial complex in his 2003 Science article, Science as a Way of Life: Perplexities of a Physician Scientist. I should note that I am a nurse, and nursing is different from medicine. I'm not in this lecture talking about nursing, though sadly these days nursing is very much a part of that industrial complex. It was in the home of the medical industrial complex that this meeting on integrative health had taken place. As I have said, what was being discussed at the meeting was integrating indigenous people's medicinal substances into the medical industrial complex. Now, I had read articles on cultural appropriation of indigenous people's use of plants, substance, and practices. Let me pause by saying, by indigenous people, I refer to ethnic groups who are original settlers or native to a particular country or origin. as opposed to more recently settled groups who may have colonized the area. But my reading on this cultural appropriation aside, I had not thought about what this integration meant. I had not truly thought about what goes on when we take indigenous peoples' medicinal substances and practices out of their ways of life and integrate them into the American medical industrial complex. Although related to cultural appropriation, the something more I am interested in is this industrial complex's separation of the medicinal substance or practice from the way of life in which that substance or practice had its home, that is, its original application. This separation, I believe, changes the substance or practice. That is, I do not believe that the substance or the practice is the same when it's integrated into the American medical industrial complex as when originally used by indigenous people. Let's begin, however, with a description of a current use of a medicinal substance originally used by indigenous people, psilocybin. I do not have time today, or really in my daily life, to do justice to the work that's been done on psilocybin in the treatment of depression over the last several years. It's voluminous. In fact, 500 papers on the subject are currently indexed in the National Library of Medicine, or at least when I checked a few weeks ago. At the risk of an imprecise review of that literature, let me just say that psilocybin is showing promise for treating depression, and I might add anxiety. Roland Griffiths and his team at Johns Hopkins started studying this hallucinogen, and I'm using the word hallucinogen on purpose instead of the more common psychedelic because of an example I am going to show later, use later on in the talk. But both are used, hallucinogen and psychedelic. But they started studying psilocybin in the early 2000s with a transformational paper in 2006 in psychopharmacology, in which they reported on a study about whether psilocybin, along with guided therapy, produced mystical experience. And that's what they called it, mystical experience. They continued in this pursuit of the production of mystical experience with what they called, quote, the active agent in sacred mushrooms, end quote. In a study reported in the Frontiers of Psychology in 2017 by Barrett, a member of Griffith's team, researchers combined the active agent in sacred mushrooms with music and guided psychotherapy to identify the type of music that best facilitated these mystical experiences. The important point is that Griffiths and his team were interested in mystical experience, in the mystical experience the active agent produced, with music as a facilitator. But their interest was in the production of a mystical experience. After Barrett's work, the work of Griffith's team had progressed to studying this active agent in a randomized waitlist controlled trial in patients diagnosed with moderate or severe major depression. The treatment was 8 weeks long and involved 18 in-person visits, including 2 day-long psilocybin administration sessions and preparatory meetings before the first psilocybin session, as well as follow-up meetings after psilocybin sessions. After the preparatory meetings, the 2 psilocybin administration sessions, which were 8 hours long and included having a psychotherapist present, were conducted 1.5 weeks apart. The psilocybin dose administered in the first session was what they called moderately high and high in the second session, as the team reported in a 2021 JAMA article in which they published the study's results. and these results were impressive. The effect sizes in the reduction of symptoms of major depression at follow-ups on weeks 5 and 8 after the first psilocybin administration were large. Moreover, the authors reported in the JAMA article that the onset of reduction of symptoms 1 day after administration of psilocybin was statistically significant. This immediate effect is outstanding in the treatment of depression, as there is currently no FDA-approved treatment that produces such immediate relief, maybe except for a newly approved ketamine treatment, another psychedelic or hallucinogen. These authors concluded that, quote, psilocybin with therapy is efficacious in treating major depressive disorder, end quote. At the same time, Griffith's team is studying the effect of psilocybin administration on recipients' beliefs, as measured by the Mystical Experiences Questionnaire. For they think now, as they thought when they started this line of inquiry, that the underlying mechanism of action in psilocybin's treating major depressive disorder has something to do with his ability to induce a change in beliefs by having a mystical experience. The mystical experience is key. They have to produce it, and producing it somehow changes beliefs. That is, they think that the active agent in the sacred mushroom can induce what they call, quote, non-physicalist, end quote, forms of belief. They define non-physicalist beliefs generally as beliefs that reality and consciousness cannot be reduced to matter. At one point in a 2022 paper in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, they call these beliefs spiritual beliefs. Indeed, in a 2022 paper in which they report on a study in which they measured spiritual beliefs before and after participants were administered psilocybin, a whole 30% of participants who did not believe in a God or a higher power before administration did so after administration. 30%. As the Griffiths team reported in the paper, the mystical experience induced by psilocybin was associated with greater changes in spiritual beliefs. Interestingly, in this 2022 paper in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, the authors state in the introduction that they are interested in hallucinogens because of their use in diverse cultures has been associated with non-physicalist or spiritual forms of belief. Specifically, they are interested in hallucinogens' ability to induce increases in people's sense of, quote, connectedness to humanity, life, and the God of their understanding or ultimate reality, end quote. That is what they want to induce spiritual, that is, they want to induce spiritual, even theological beliefs by psilocybin-mediated mystical experiences. Of course, their unstated premise, but the premise they've been testing for 15 years now, is that spiritual beliefs induced by these psilocybin-mediated mystical experiences treat major depressive disorder. That is the transformative power of integrating psilocybin into psychiatric care, according to Griffith's team. The taking of a hallucinogen and the having of a mystical experience while undergoing the hallucinogens, and I should add, a therapist's influence, leads to a belief in something greater than oneself. And this belief provides relief from a psychological malady. One can hear in Griffith's work the echoes of William James in his 1901 Gifford lectures published as The Varieties of Religious Experience. James's spiritualism was for him, in a real famous passage in The Varieties, a relief, if only temporary, from his own soul's dark nights. But it sounds a lot like what takes place in the 1973 documentary film, Magical Death, made and narrated by the somewhat famous American anthropologist who at the time was at Penn State, Napoleon Chagnon, in which he explores the role of the use of a hallucinogen and a shaman in the Yanomamo culture. I should add that this video you can get online on our library, and it's only 34 minutes long. I encourage you to watch it. The only difference is that the practices of the Yanomamo regarding the use of a hallucinogen and the role of the shaman are set within a way of life. What is going on in Griffith's research reverses the order of what goes on in the Yanomamo's use of a hallucinogen. In indigenous use of hallucinogens in the case depicted by Chagnon's film of the Yanomamo and in other cases described by other anthropologists, a way of life comes first. I'm not an anthropologist, I'm a philosopher nurse, so let me stick to what I know by describing what is meant in philosophy by a way of life. I use the term way of life intentionally. When you hear way of life, some of you trained in philosophy, of course, will think of Ludwig Wittgenstein's term form of life, which he coined in his 1953 posthumously published Philosophical Investigations, which was translated and edited by Elizabeth Anscombe, one of his famous students, whose daughter, Barbara Geach, happened to be a nurse that I got to know very well. Wittgenstein used the phrase only 5 times in the Investigations, and so it's not gotten as much attention in the philosophical literature as many of other Wittgenstein's technical terms, that all of which seem to elude definition. However, the contemporary Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben and the French philosopher Pierre Hadot, professor of history and of Hellenic and Roman thought in the Collège de France, who died in 2010, have both written about form of life, or way of life, depending on how one translates it. And let me say that henceforth, I am going to stick with the term way of life. The first point to make about way of life is that both Agamben and Hadot define it with predicates that have to do with spirituality. These make sense, as in fragmentary notes, Wittgenstein suggests that spirituality is not something that can be reduced to a set of propositions or beliefs, but rather is a way of living. He also suggested that religious language and rituals are important ways of communicating and understanding that which is beyond our ken. Talk of way of life tries to get at what is, in a way, beyond our ken, namely life or living itself. Agamben says that what is at stake in a way of life is living itself, the life, the human life, and the processes of living that life are all inextricably intertwined. Agamben writes in his 2000 book, Means Without End, that a way of life defines a life, human life, in which the single ways, acts, and processes of living are never simply facts, but always above the possibilities of life, always and above all power. Each behavior and each form of human living is never prescribed by a specific biological vocation, nor is it assigned by whatever necessity. Instead, no matter how customary, repeated, and socially compulsory it always retains the character of possibility. That is, it always puts at stake living itself. In a later book, in his 2013, The Highest Power, Agamben situates this notion of way of life as living itself in the context of spirituality. He argues that the traditional distinction between sacred and profane has largely today been lost. Contemporary forms of spirituality, he said, are disconnected from traditional religious practices. Instead, modern spirituality is characterized by a search for a sense of transcendence or a connection to something beyond the self, as in Griffith's research. This transcendence or connection to something beyond the self is not necessarily connected to traditional religious practices. Agamben suggests that this search for transcendence is a response to the sense of alienation and emptiness that results from the disconnection between individual and communal ways of life that are inherent in traditional practices. A traditional practice, on the contrary, is the medium in which ontological transformation occurs. The ontological transformation Griffiths is interested in through the psilocybin-mediated experience. The ontological transformation of believing in something greater than oneself, or even in Griffith's notion, theological beliefs. For Agamben, the ontological transformation is one in which the metaphysical entity of life itself is disclosed, or rather discloses itself to us through living ways of life. And I think it's important to add communal ways of life. For the purposes of the talk today, instead of saying the way of life is the medium for disclosing life itself, let me go to the philosopher and Nobel economist Amartya Sen's phrase and say that a way of life discloses to us that which is of ultimate value to us. I don't think we would be too far off to say that for most of us, it would be what Agamben says, disclosing life. Ado, like Agamben, says that this disclosure comes through the living. We live a certain way of life to discover that which is of ultimate value to us. Let me explain. Ado's central thesis in his 1995 book, Philosophy as a Way of Life, which Arnold Davidson edited and Michael Chase translated, was that ancient philosophies like Stoicism and Epicureanism were ways of living. By adhering to these ways of living, adherents underwent a personal transformation. Let's take the Stoics as an example, how that personal transformation happened. And it's the example Ado uses in his book. That which was of ultimate value in Stoicism was the resignation of oneself to events in the world. The acts inherent in the Stoic way of life involved philosophical discourse or philosophizing about logic, physics, and ethics. Now, philosophizing is both setting forth a theory and teaching that theory. But through the setting forth of a theory and the teaching of the theory, Stoics underwent a transformation in which they accepted the events of the world as they are. And so the Stoic way of life was not divided into its various theories and instances of teaching those theories. Rather, Ado says, the Stoic way of life was a unitary act that consisted in living logic, physics, and ethics. And the important point is that by living logic, physics, and ethics, Stoics underwent the personal transformation by which they came to that which they valued most, accepting the world as it is. Important here is that someone who became a Stoic did so because they wanted to resign themselves to the world as it is. They wanted the personal transformation. That was what was of ultimate value to them. They wanted to give up striving to change the world. That's why the potential Stoic chose to adopt the actual Stoic way of life. The choice of the way of life is paramount, for one chooses it for the effect it's intended to have upon one. The discourse or the philosophizing comes about not to satisfy various epistemic desiderata, but to exercise a strong effect upon the person, namely to modify the person's behavior and to transform them into someone who accepted the world as it is. Note that the choice came first. The various philosophical schools of antiquity, Addo says, were characterized above all by their choice of a form of life, which is justified after the fact by a given systematic construction. For example, Stoicism is the choice of an attitude of coherence with oneself, which is later justified by a general theory of the coherence of the universe with itself. Discourse or philosophizing is secondary to the way of life. That is secondary to, in a consequent kind of way. Discourse or philosophizing comes from the living. It explains the living. It lays out the tenets of the living, but the living comes first. And it is the living that begets the insights of how to accept the world, of how to do what one chose to do in the first place. It is easy to see now that the purpose of a way of life is to disclose through personal transformation what Agamben called ontological transformation, that which we had most valued before we adopted that way of life. And the living of the way of life begets this personal transformation. Any beliefs, tenets, or insights we have about the way of life come after we've lived it, and as a discourse are only an approximation of living it. I repeat for the sake of emphasis, it is the living of the way of life that produces a personal transformation. It is the living of a way of life that allows for a mystical experience, which then begets beliefs, tenets, or insights. Chagnon's film, Chagnon, who died in 2019, perhaps fetishized the Yanomamo by going to southern Venezuela and Brazil and studying and filming them as living a so-called primitive way of life. Likewise, Griffith's team studying the effect of medically inducing a mystical experience may be construed as a fetishization of the mystical experience. But what I find important to say about Chagnon's work is that through the voice of a narrator, we never hear the shaman talking about his beliefs in the spirits that come to inhabit him when the hallucinogen opens him up to the spirit world. Indeed, he does not call whatever he snorts a hallucinogen. Moreover, the shaman does not need whatever he inhales to believe in the spirit world. It is as real to him before he inhales whatever it is as after it he is so-called under its influence. Using the hallucinogen is merely a part of his practice, a part of practice that is taught as part of the way of life to Yanomamo children, as Chagnon captures in his later 1974 film, Children's Magical Death. The children learn the way of life from the shaman, and in this learning, the reality of the spirit world presents itself to them. even while not under the influence of the hallucinogen the shaman snorts. The hallucinogen is, I think, what an icon does in Eastern Christianity. It's a celestial portal that would not be a celestial portal without the whole way of life. A way of life one learned to live prior to be entranced into the celestial world. It is not the basic premise. Is this not the basic premise of James's varieties, that ways of life, that ways of living constitute who we are and what we believe? Along these lines, Richard Gombrich, a contemporary scholar of Buddhism, in the early 1970s, transformed the study of religion by suggesting that spiritual ways of life have an affective primacy. In other words, emotion comes first. We feel our ways of life before we think them. We feel them in the way the Yanomamo children felt them before they believed them. The current work of psychologists who study emotion, such as Dr. Keltner at Berkeley, tend to support James's and Gombrich's view. In Chagnon's film of the Yanomamo children, the children felt what they were seeing lived in front of them by the shaman. They felt what later they could put into a general theory, a theory that may have included statements about belief in the spirit world and the use of a hallucinogen to enter that world. But the living, which is an emotional, comes first, as Keltner argues in his 2023 book, Awe, The New Science of Everyday Wonder, and how it can transform your life. Surely the children chose their way of life because it was the only one they knew, unlike the Stoics that Hadot wrote about. But as with the Stoics, the living comes first. It comes first for the Yanomamo children in Chagnon's film, and it comes first for us, I aver. Only after the living, that is, only after feeling the way of life, comes the spiritual transformation, and then the subsequent defense. If this is the case, we must ask ourselves this fundamental question: what is the way of life into which uses of psilocybin, among other hallucinogens like ketamine, and other spiritual practices like acupuncture, massage, tai chi, and yoga are being integrated? What is the way of life in which the medical industrial complex has its home? It is a way of life in which taking a pill, injecting a substance, applying this or that salve, or cutting this or that out, or inserting this or that into the body is a practice. It can be a spiritual practice insofar as it induces some transformative effect on the self. For as placebo studies suggest, the practice involves a kind of personal transformation that on an emotional level, we feel something will come of it. And of course, such an effect often occurs. Now, let me say straight up, I am not an adherent of Mary Baker Eddy's belief that reality is purely spiritual and that physical illness is not real, but rather only a mental malady. Physical illness is real, and many medical and surgical treatments have been proven to ameliorate and even cure physical illnesses. But our engagement with the American medical industrial complex as patients is part of our way of life. We, as with the Yanomamo children, grew up believing, even feeling, that it can and would keep us healthy. We just have to take a pill, insert the needle and inject the medication, or undergo the knife and all will be well. And when there is no cure, science will progress, as it has indeed progressed so much, if not for us, then for those who will come after us, a line used in almost every informed consent for a trial of a medication that has no hope of curing patients dying of advanced cancer, but has shown promise in other studies. If this treatment will not be of benefit to you, it may be for others. This is our way of life. It's a medical way of life. And into this medical way of life, we seek to integrate a substance. We call it a medicinal substance or an integrative therapy, though that is not what those who have traditionally used it in their way of life would have called it. Specifically for my purposes today, we seek to integrate into this medical way of life the injection, literally into our veins, of a substance that will induce a spiritual experience that will in turn induce belief in the sacred. But sadly, there is no attendant way of life in which this experience and this belief have a home. With what? With whom? With what community? And with what set of shared practices that compromise a living of that which we have reason to value, attend this taking of the hallucinogenic medication? The way of life is the mechanism of action. That is, the way of life produces the effect in the Yanomamo's use of the hallucinogen, which is merely a portal into the world they have believed existed before they knew what belief was. The mechanism of action was not the effect of the hallucinogen on the serotonin 2A receptor, as postulated by Singleton and colleagues in a 2022 paper in Nature Communications. Take another example. The mechanism of action in yoga, in which yoga, let me start that sentence over. The mechanism of action in which yoga induces a higher order of consciousness is the way of life. I apologize, I got lost in my own head here. The mechanism of action in which yoga induces a higher order of consciousness is the way of life in which inducing a higher order of consciousness through spiritual practices has a home. The way of life, that mechanism of action, differs from the mechanism of action of Bikram yoga, of the Bikram yoga class I went to, and during which I nearly had heat stroke, but after which my muscles and connective tissues were much looser. Relaxation and looser muscles and connective tissues even reduce stress hormones, though all very good endpoints. These are not the endpoints of yoga in a way of life in which yoga induces higher order of consciousness. On this point, I commend to you Judith Farquhar's wonderful little book published in 2020 by Yale Press, A Way of Life, Things, Thoughts, and Actions in Chinese Medicine. What is the way of life into which we integrate these spiritual practices of using hallucinogens as celestial portals into a reality we do not question, and of other healing practices that arose from ways of life foreign to the American medical industrial system? Whatever it was, Floyd Bloom suggests that now it is one of turning a profit in the taking of a pill, an injection, or undergoing the knife, all of which I'm grateful for and have done. It is a race within the academic medicine of being the first to discover, the first to cure, the first to publish the findings in the highest impact journals that get reported in the New York Times and on NPR, and to be part of an enterprise that gets the most funding from the National Institutes of Health. We advertise our healthcare centers by how much funding scientists have secured from the NIH in competitive granting processes. All of this may suggest a way of life insofar as it suggests that which is of ultimate value to the American medical system. let me be childish for a moment and take on something very much larger than my purposes here today by saying that the American medical system sits within the American system. Effectively, the problem is that human health, well-being, and meaning in life are treated in American capitalism as no different from any other commodity. There is a qualitative difference between a commodity and human health, well-being, and meaning in life. The question is, what is the way of life adherents of the medical industrial complex have chosen to live in order to undergo a personal transformation? This question is paramount, for it is into this complex that integrative health seeks to integrate spiritual practices that arose from indigenous ways of life. As you can see by now, I do not believe this can be done. Perhaps it is a rediscovering of the practice of healthcare in general, not just medicine, as a spiritual practice, as my colleague and co-author, the contemporary physician philosopher Daniel Sulmasy put it in his 2006 Georgetown Press book, The Rebirth of the Clinic, an introduction of spirituality in healthcare. I wish to end by suggesting what this might look like. Hadot thought that schools of philosophy like Stoicism or Epicureanism were themselves way of life. The lesson of these schools was for adherents to transform themselves through exercises that were neither simply of thought nor of morality. They were spiritual exercises in that they aimed at transforming adherents' vision of the world. They aimed at a metamorphosis of their personalities. These spiritual exercises had an existential value. Their intended effect was a transformation of sensibilities, of how people felt and viewed the world. This is, of course, what Griffith's team rightly wants to accomplish for people who suffer. But if the hallucinogens and other practices of the integrative health movement are to be able to do this for people who suffer by changing their feelings, their sensibilities, and their views of the world, these treatments must be administered by people within the American healthcare system who are practitioners of healthcare because they too want this transformation for themselves. These treatments must be administered by practitioners who do not view the treatments as complementary to conventional medicine, but rather as part of their own ways of living. Their practice of healthcare must be for them a spiritual practice in which a way of life, in a spiritual practice in a way of life in which they themselves have a personal transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. I'm doing some work here quickly to bring us all back into the fold. I would invite Tyrus, your thoughts first as chair and introducer of Mark's work.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. It was a really wonderful and rich talk. I had a question about a couple of the examples that you brought up, and I just wanted to kind of tease out a question here. So I heard two somewhat different connections that you made between way of life and the spiritual. One of them, using the example of the shaman that you discussed, there's a fully integrated relationship between the different elements of the practices and the beliefs. So the shaman and the people, including children who are still learning, the use of the hallucinogen, what I presume to be, storytelling and speech, and also then belief. But you also bring up the example of Stoicism and also psychotherapy. And I would actually throw in here religious conversion, at least in the Christian tradition, where it's a matter of a change in the way of life. And that is a choice of living in a new way and adopting a new form of life. So I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about that kind of latter model, and just ask, what would it mean to prepare and to make a change of life, a conscious, reflected change of life in a healthcare context? And I also just wanted to ask a little bit about the spiritual in connection to that idea, which is, could we also view this change of life as not involving necessarily spiritual in the religious or transcendent sense, but in a little bit more secular vein, what we might think of as ethical values, like I'm going to be kinder to my family, I'm going to heal my relationships to my children, or embracing a civic responsibility where I'm going to be an activist, or I'm going to try to help others not experience the injustice or the inequality that I have in my experience. Anyway, those are really the two questions that I want to pose about the change of life and then the scope of the spiritual that you're talking about.
Thank you, Tyrus. You're right. Ado talks about way of life, that the spiritual exercises as a way of life are those exercises that are intended to produce an effect upon a person in a kind of transformational way, or a convert, what you might suggest a conversion. Though people who adopted Stoicism or Epicureanism did so because they wanted that conversion, right? They weren't proselytized, as it were. They wanted to say, live in the moment for the Epicurean, or take pleasure in the moment, not worry about the future in a very simplistic way, or for the Stoic to not strive against the world as it is. And that differs from the use of way of life that I was illustrating in the Yanomamo, or say in people who believe in yoga or practice yoga because it induces higher orders of consciousness. And one may convert to those ways, right? But and one may leave those ways. But I was interested in the Yanomamo, or say the Chinese medicine use of yoga, to show that as with the Stoic, once you've come to this way of life, it just makes sense within it, right? It has its own sort of, you don't need to justify it within it, and it's not there to produce beliefs. You come to them, to those, you're in that way of life believing already in the spirit world, or in the higher order of consciousness that the practice will induce in you. And so it's to show the reverse order of what's happening by introducing hallucinogens to instill the belief, right? That was my purpose there. And the slide was perhaps a little too quick. The second question was more about how can we do that with practitioners now? Yeah, that's the big question. I think it is, for me, what you illustrate. I mean, if we look at some of the great physician philosophers, let's use James, right? William James. Then I bring him intentionally because he was a physician philosopher. We can go back into medieval to the Middle Ages. Some of the great Islamic philosophers were also physicians. Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina. I think their way of life wasn't so much one of doxastic ways of life, of tenets, of beliefs, of, orthodoxy, but rather of what you describe, doing good for one's fellow human being. And that drove them to practice. James never really practiced, but the Islamic philosopher physicians did, to practice for the purposes of the betterment of humanity. And that was a spiritual way of life for them. So I don't think you have to have a sort of a doxastic, what I call, the whole set of creedal beliefs to have a spiritual way of life. Did that answer the question? Yeah, thanks.
Duncan, I think I know you and Grace had a question.
That's right. I'm hoping Grace will behave for the next 2 minutes. That was a great talk, Mark. So I'm so pleased to hear Haddo's work getting discussed like this. Yeah, he's one of my philosophical heroes, and he's not read nearly enough. So glad to hear him being discussed. I was wanting to mention one thing. I think this connects to the first point that Tyrus was saying, and I think actually this is like it strengthens your hand. There's this other theme in Wittgenstein's work, which it crops up in his final notebooks in Uncertainty, which I think actually really lends a lot of support to what you're arguing for. Yeah. Wittgenstein there introduced this idea of a hinge commitment. These hinge commitments, these like basic certainties that they're manifestations of our worldview. They're rooted in our actions. They're not, at least on my reading of it, they're not beliefs. They're irrational. They're what make reasoning and rational evaluations possible. They're not themselves to be thought of in rational terms. And Wittgenstein's, what he's doing in those notebooks, it seems to me, is offering like this profoundly anti-modernist picture. Yeah. He's saying that it's not a limitation of reason that it be like this, that reasons are essentially local. That's just what it is. That's what it is to be rational. Mm-hmm. So the modernist picture, the picture on which reasons that work all the way down, that picture just simply is incoherent. Yeah. And he wants to have this alternative picture. So the alternative picture is precisely as you're describing here, a way of life rooted in actions, in these certainties. These certainties were essentially expressions of value. And that the thought is that's the correct way to think about what it is to be a rational subject. And of course, that has huge implications for how you understand a way of life, how one changes a way of life, what that would consist in. Not to think of this just simply as changing one's beliefs or something like that. And that might be right. Part of it. It's fundamentally it's a change in values and actions, and it's the kind of thing that takes place. It would have to be a process over time of being inculcated into a new way of life. So I think this other theme in Wittgenstein's work actually, which it flowed on from the investigations, but was quite late on. I mean, these notebooks take us to just a few days before he dies. Those ideas, I think, would actually support what you're going for.
Thank you for that. And I know of the hinge commitments, and but it's been a long time since I've gotten into Uncertainty, and and his particularly his views on Glaube, right, belief, right, and this is exactly where you're going, I think. And I do wonder though, for Wittgenstein, these would have to be set within ways of life, ways of speaking, even, and those. That implies a certain community, and I do wonder what we're doing when we're prescribing something that has to be set within a certain community, as with the taking of a hallucinogen or a psychedelic, and part of why I wonder that is, I don't know if any of you saw the article in the Sunday New York Times, which came out too late for me to revise my talk, of how people are administering ketamine to themselves at home and outside of any context, or any sort of communal living or any sort of guidance or way of life, and it's having hugely detrimental effects, including with downstream substance use disorders.
Thank you. I think you bring up this whole talk is bringing up first of all, the importance of philosophy and connecting with other forms of life. And I would like to ask a question that's here in the Q&A box, and teeing that question up. What you mention is doing something for the purpose of something else versus doing as living, as putting that living itself at stake. So there is no living, and then its valuation is done as a distinct act, which then brings me to the question that Roger has is, don't we need some way to know if the sensibilities are good or bad? I agree parts of philosophy should be more joined up. I'm wondering if you have some response to that.
You mean, of course, I, some ways of knowing, I think we know what's good and bad. Let me just, without getting into all of that, evaluating morality, let's just take ketamine usage now. Ketamine was studied in randomized controlled trials for the treatment of depression in guided therapy, and had, much like Griffith's studies, had follow-up sessions with therapists, etc. And I think what they're trying to do there is this approximation of a way of life or a community. But outside of anything like that, ketamine has now taken on a sort of detrimental effect. And we know it's bad because people are administering it at home, and then having bad trips, and having then reporting addiction to it and so forth. So we see its bad effects. And certainly there are ways of life that you can see from the living of them aren't moral. And what I am trying to suggest, even, that integrating these sort of practices within the medical industrial complex, in which, there's the whole attendant thing of yoga would do you good, come to my yoga class, and that's prescribed, and now I can bill for it. It's that takes it completely out of the sort of way of life in which yoga is to induce this higher order of consciousness and an effective state. That, I think, is bad itself, right? It's in a very simple a cultural appropriation. But that's my own view.
The idea of, you'd mentioned approximation of a way of life versus ways of life.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. There is another question. I think it's a question in the chat, and I'll go ahead and ask it. Rochelle says, "Thank you for your thoughtful analysis." I believe she's asking, wondering if Spinozan ontologies of knowledge might be interesting here and was influenced by Stoics. What we know in visual traditions, parenthesis, imaginary knowledge, versus rationality versus intuitive divine knowledge, and what we know at a deeper level, etc. So I don't know if that's a question so much as a thought riff that maybe you would want to riff off of.
I don't know. I might have to defer to Duncan on this, but Spinoza, it's been a long time since I read Spinoza, and monism, I really don't know if I can make a connection there. I'm not going to venture into it. But beyond Spinoza, what was the other part?
Let me go back to it. I think what's going on here is a contrasting in imaginary knowledge, rational knowledge, intuitive knowledge, divine knowledge, what we know at a deeper level. So it's
yeah, I think for me, some really important stuff that Dr. Keltner is doing out of his lab in Berkeley. I think they actually call it the Greater Good Lab. It's got some term like that. but where he's working on emotion. And he's been studying emotion for a very long time and seeing how emotion affects our well-being. And then I think how it affects our thoughts. And I think something very important has come out of this work, in that perhaps thoughts don't come first. And perhaps thoughts about, even in psychotherapy, CBT, how do we know that we've actually changed thoughts, right? That's always eluded me in a randomized controlled trial of behavioral therapy, right? You can measure the behavior, but when you add cognition onto it, how do you know you've changed people's thinking? And Keltner stays away from that completely and away from knowledge, and said, let's just deal with emotion. And so I think that how to get at knowledge is something that eludes me. I think I can get at emotional states first. And I think that's the way into it. We feel our ways of life, and then we can identify what we believe out of those ways of life. But I don't think that belief comes first. I don't think that knowledge comes first. I think the living and the sort of feeling of that comes first. And I think even Hadot would say that, right? That the living of the logic and the physics and the ethics comes first, and then you can create your sort of discourses or what you think you know about it. But I'm less certain about knowledge all the time, so I'll leave it at that. And Duncan,
Just a quick thought on that. I mean, I think that's exactly the right way to go. I wonder though whether you could have a room made perhaps for know-how, because it seems what's being rejected is a kind of propositional knowledge.
yep, that's right.
And that doesn't have the primacy, but these ways of acting could be thought of in terms of sort of know-how, a kind of embodied expertise or something. And that might be a way of bringing something back in, which is, of that ilk. It's just not of the propositional belief-like kind,
Absolutely. I would agree with that completely. Tyrus, you were...
Yeah, I thought I would just jump in here really briefly, and maybe some of what's behind the question about Spinoza is something that I hear very much in your presentation, which is the attempt to think of implicitness or immanence, where these things aren't separated; they are actually aspects of a same process. There are different frames. There are obviously philosophical frames. There are ecological ways that we think about immanence, but it seems to me that's kind of the difficult problem that you're getting at, is how you define those elements that appear in an immanent process. Is it knowledge? Is it practice? Is it emotion? It really depends on kind of the frames with which you describe those different elements and their relations. But that seems to me the key issue there is that idea in a way of life that there are implications that can be conceptual, but can also be not yet conceptual, but forms of thought nevertheless.
I would completely agree with that, and so I now get the monad here. So thanks, Tyrus.
It gets at this way of life we perhaps have of of putting knowing what is ontological, putting into epistemology what is ontological.
Yeah.
So sorry that took so long for me to put that out. And I say that because there is a question from Roger about how I don't know what they is, can be disentangled, but I'm assuming it's a gesture at what was just being spoken about, quote unquote, different forms of knowledge versus ways of life. And does disentangling, is that what is to be done?
No, I think Duncan's right on. And of course, I love the pragmatists. So, there's a certain know-how that comes out of this, right? And you can move from the know-how to writing a discourse, and we may call that discourse knowledge. But if we disentangle that knowledge from the know-how and from the living, then I don't think we have anything of substance.
I would be one to agree with you. We have another question from Christopher, where he asks, expanding on the ideas or philosophy shared about adopting a quote way of life, have you pondered, and I think Christopher's talking as someone who came to the profession after other training, or maybe you too, how nursing expects personal transformation via training as a nurse. I'm thinking in relation to new policies around the hallucinogenic in Oregon and training for quote guides or who could be nurses.
Yeah, I don't know the policies in Oregon, but let me say that for nurses, for physicians, for anybody going into there's social workers, anybody going, teachers into a field in which your primary role is to assist others. Of course, there can be personal transformation. The training is complicated, but let me just set the training aside for a moment. We all have, and let me just talk about nursing because I'm on safer ground. We've all been cared for by the nurse who's competent and delivers, precise care, but isn't necessarily the warmest or kindest individual. And we're very grateful for that very competent and precise care. But I would argue that nursing is more than that competent and precise care, that it involves some sort of human to human interaction, something that has to do with wanting to assist another person in promoting or restoring their health, wanting to assist the other person in having a peaceful death. So that is kind of what Tyrus was getting at, that there is a desire to do good toward other people. And in the doing of that good, one goes through a certain set of spiritual exercises in Hadot's sense. You become a different person. The acts act upon you as well. You start to see the world in different ways. And in some ways, as a cancer palliative care nurse practitioner, it's I've come to accept death more as just a thing that's going to happen in life, and not to be scienced out of existence, right? That's a personal transformation for me. It was a very much a deep that was a change in who I was before I came to this work. Those sorts of personal transformations can happen. I think they have to happen in community, though, and that as a profession, we need to start talking about how the profession can help us be the kind of people we want to be, and to help us change systems to be the kind of healthcare system we want to be. The National Health Service nurses in the UK don't have the same pressures that we do. They have different pressures. And some of the nurses who have existed who worked in the NHS before austerity measures were rolled out, and they actually had better pay and better working conditions against which they are striking now, poor pay and poor working conditions. They do talk about nursing there as a sort of community in which they wanted to do good in the world. And sadly, austerity measures seems to be seem to be changing that for them. So how do we think of nursing as a community of people who live a certain way to transform themselves at the same time that they're doing good for other people? That's what I'm interested in. And that happens perhaps in the teaching of it. It happens in the practice of it, perhaps more so. But teaching of it, that's the training of it. That's perhaps for another talk. There are lots of stuff there. I'll move beyond that.
Thank you for that great answer. And piggybacking on that, Sarah Valentine mentions in the chat about ways of life, medicine way of life, nursing way of life, and you do talk, I thought, very evocatively about the medical way of life. How do these ways of life interact in our healthcare world, and with what consequences?
Well, it's hard. It's hard to be alive in the United States today and go to your primary care appointment and not come away with a pill to take, right? And yet we want to take these pills because there's quite a bit of proof. Let's just take the statins, for example. Quite a bit of proof that most of us at the age of 50 should just start taking a statin as our standard because of reduced chances of stroke or heart attack, unless we want to totally revamp the American way of eating and not exercising and all of that goes with our urbanized Western lifestyle. So I'm grateful for that type of science and all that. But sadly, what has been lost in all of that is a certain way of life that even my grandparents lived, right? Of growing their own food, of walking everywhere that they went, of a less urbanized, a less industrial approach to living. And that is our healthcare right now. It is very industrial. It is very urbanized. It differs by where you live. All that we know about. How do we be in it, but try to live a way of life that espouses something different is a big question for me. A big and hard sort of practical question.
You bring up, though, I think something that maybe we don't think of, the medical way of life as the American way of life. I haven't heard it put in those terms, but it's true. Every time we put a pill in our body, we are living the medical way of life.
Yeah, one of my loves is to stream Premier League football on Saturdays and Sunday mornings. Every time I do, I'm hit with commercials about a pill, about something you can do, you can get from your doctor to make your life better. Every single Saturday and Sunday morning.
So are we all living a multiplicity?
Well, yeah, we're all living multiplicities of ways of life, but we have to start naming the medical way of life as one of those. Duncan, you're gonna.
Yeah, just a quick thing. Another positive thought. I should feel like a philosopher. I should be saying critical things, but I can only think of positive things. But it strikes me that another advantage of your approach is that it avoids one worry some people have about forms of life, which is that one criticism is that they're inherently legitimating. They don't subject the form of life to critique. But it seems, when we think of it in the way that Haddo thinks of it in transformative terms, it isn't like that, because sometimes the forms of life, they include values which are dubious. I mean, they can include ideology, which should be critiqued and so forth. So I think I like the way that you're presenting it. I think it's very useful. I just want to flag that.
Yeah, well, thank you. I was speaking about this with a friend this weekend, and she said, well, isn't, and I apologize if I offend anyone, but isn't MAGA a way of life, right? And aren't they, these sort of self-legitimizing, self-referential ways of belief? And yeah, I think that is a possibility. But a philosophical way of life in Haddo's sense is always self-critical, right? Always has this you're always asking yourself if what you're doing is not good. I mean, and I know we'd have to define the good there. And I guess I do agree with Iris Murdoch. It has a certain sovereignty over everything that we do. Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in on this question of the medical way of life, and you were speaking about kind of the eating habits and the way that has a certain kind of complementarity with the medical way of life, and I just wanted to say that I resonated with that, having heard one of UCI's sleep experts talk about how she very regularly gets this question, like, how could I sleep better? What could I take what supplement should I take? These sorts of things. And, her approach is to say, let's look at actually what sleep is and, and why you do it. And in what ways do our ways of life disrupt that? And so it's not really a question of, what could I do? What could I take to sleep better? It's, how could I actually live my life in a way where sleep has an organic relationship to it? And, we're not in this characteristic disturbed modern rhythm of work and waking and sleep and pumping pills to get up and pumping pills to get down again.
Yes, and I think we may have been at the same talk, and it's very interesting, getting sunshine in the day, exercise, right? Being in nature, and yet in my own work and way of life, I have to strive for that, right? It just is so phenomenal. Like, I've got to be intentional about living in a way, and I think this is something very much a part of Haddo's work, that there is an intentionality to a way of life. There is a certain agency that we have to embrace in it.
What you just said made me think of something you mentioned earlier in your talk, where maybe this is my version of what you said, but living is not a fact. It always puts itself at stake.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that might get to the question that was being asked, if living is itself what's at stake, which is what we do by living, where does that intentionality, where does that live? Is it literally just in the consequences, which then provide the conditions for the next little bit of living?
I don't know, but I think it can't live in isolation. Intentionality and criticism are always done in community, and that's something that I think that in a way of life involves other people living it with you, and other people offering criticisms with you, and much what we're doing now, right? Thinking with you. Ways of life I think are inherently philosophical. They do involve living first, but also then living the logic, physics, and ethics, but then talking about them and discoursing about them. That's part of living.
Thank you. I think we have addressed the majority of the questions that have been asked, and we're getting to time. Tyrus, I'm wondering if there are any last minute questions or words or thoughts as chair of this event before we say adieu.
No, not for me. I think we've had a wonderful conversation and also just a very, a very thought-provoking talk by Mark, and happy to have been part of this event.
Duncan, any last? Yeah.
I'll just say excellent talk. Thanks very much, Mark. That was great.
You're welcome.
Mark, you will have the last word.
Thank you, Miriam, for inviting me to this, and Duncan and Tyrus for your comments and having read the talk, and everyone who attended. I'm grateful for all of this and hope that we can continue asking the tough questions about who we are and what we're doing as healthcare providers and thinkers about healthcare. Thank you.
I want to thank you so much, Mark and Tyrus and Duncan, for being here, and the audience. Thank you to everybody. And just one last word. This event has been recorded, and you will all receive a link to the recorded event, and it will go up on the website so that it can be available to others, including a lot of people that registered but were not able to attend. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for handling that, Miriam. You did a great job.
Thank you. I'm just saving the chat really quick. Okay. Have a wonderful rest of your day with grace.
Okay, thanks. See you.